Okay, so I wanted to talk a little bit about how I see the broader context of the debate that you're about to watch, both in terms of a few specific things that you're going to see me discuss with Walter, and why I think debates like this are worth doing, as absurd as some of the conversation can get. And tying into that, the biggest point I wanted to make tonight, which is about how I think leftists often respond to libertarians in ways that are unhelpful because we take too much of their framing on board. So the debate you're about to watch is a follow-up to a written debate that played out in the pages of Marion West magazine. It started with an article that I wrote, we should have the graphic, called "The Case for Democratic Socialism." And by the way, we've got links to all of these in the description, but this is one of the things I wrote last year that I was happiest about, because what it really is me thinking through the normative foundations of why I care about socialism in the first place in a way that I really don't get a chance to do in most things that I write for most other places. In the article, I argue that for socialism is a fulfillment of the basic values proclaimed by the revolutions at the end of the 18th century that gave birth to the modern world, the American Revolution, the French Revolution, the Haitian Revolution, what Marxists call the bourgeois democratic revolutions. So in the original French, those values would be liberté, égalité, and fraternité, roughly freedom, equality, and social solidarity. I do a pretty deep dive on all three in the essay, and I even recap a little bit of it in the recorded debate, so I'm going to try not to repeat too much of what I say there here, but I'll just say a couple of things about it. Certainly the equality part is easy enough to see in an era where the gap between the super rich and the rest of us has metastasized to a level that would have been genuinely unimaginable when our parents were the ages that we are now. I just wrote an article for Unheard about how absurd I think it is that we call super rich people in Russia oligarchs, but we don't use the same word for the ultra rich in this country, even though the likes of Jeff Bezos and Elon Musk have both vastly more wealth and vastly more political power than their brother oligarchs in Moscow and St. Petersburg. I think I'm actually going to be talking about this tomorrow on This Is Revolution podcast. But in the beginning of that article in Unheard, I quote my good friend Rob Larson's book, Mastering the Universe, where he talks about Russian billionaire Farkhad Akhmedov, who is often mentioned in the press as an oligarch. And fair enough, that guy is so rich that he has this super yacht that features a pair of helipads, a small submarine, and a pool that goes across 9 separate decks. According to Rob's book, one of Akhmedov's main concerns is making sure that his ex-wife's lawyers don't get possession from him of his yacht, which he calls his beast. So that's a really, really rich guy, right? That's just extremely rich. But if Akhmedov lived in America instead of Russia, his net worth would not even put him in the 400 richest Americans. Never mind the kind of wealth that you have with Jeff Bezos or Elon Musk, both of whom are literally hundreds of times richer than Farkhad Akhmedov. Right now, Musk has literally been empowered by Donald Trump through Doge to do a kind of self-inflicted version of post-Soviet shock therapy, slashing and burning through our already shriveled regulatory and welfare states. I just wrote about that for Jacobin. But even putting aside that extreme example, in general, when you have this absurd level of wealth inequality, the idea that you're going to have meaningful political equality is, it's a bad joke. If a worker from one of Jeff Bezos' warehouses calls her senator, she's going to be lucky to have a long conversation with an intern. I guarantee you that if Bezos calls, he gets to talk to the senator. So that's the equality piece of this. And social solidarity, I think, is also pretty obvious. It's certainly vivid to me since I divide my time between Rosarito and Los Angeles. And in LA, like other major cities, it's often hard to even take your dog on a walk without having to steer past people sleeping in the streets. And look, I'm a well-socialized citizen of a grotesquely inegalitarian society, so that's exactly what I do. It's what we all do. But I'm inclined to think that in a more materially equal and decent future where we didn't all have those ingrained habits, if you were out and about and you saw someone sleeping above a grate or on a park bench, you'd see it as a crisis, as an emergency. Your thought would be, my God, what can I do to help this person? The same way it would be if you saw somebody having a heart attack in the middle of the street. You don't think that every time in the world we live in. You can't think like that every time in the world we live in, when living in the streets is quite this common. You lose your mind. So we end up having a society where we're very deeply alienated from a sense of community with all of our fellow citizens. And the value of solidarity, or what the late great socialist thinker G.A. Cohen called the socialist value of community, can be a little bit harder to pin down than those other values that I mentioned, can feel a little fuzzy, but I generally don't trust anyone who doesn't think this is an important value. One way to parse it, which I should say is a bit different from how Cohen would think about it, but I think it gets to much the same point, is that just having a society, like solidarity means having a society where we design our institutions in such a way that we treat every single person as if they were part of the community of who we actually give a shit about. That we don't just tell them best of luck, but you're on your own. And lest anyone misunderstand this point, I'm not saying that we all need to take fraternité, so literally that, you're every bit as invested in every random stranger on the street as you would be in like your own literal brother or sister having a life crisis and ending up on the streets. Obviously, that's not psychologically possible, and even on some level, even desirable. We're all naturally and inevitably somewhat partial to particular people who are emotionally connected to. That's as it should be. But, we all, as Thomas Nagel put it, have our own lives to live. But the point is that when we come together as a society to construct social and economic and political institutions, what we want to do is create collective institutions that really are impartial, that really aren't indifferent to the fate of anyone in that society. Okay, so like I said, I think equality and solidarity are maybe straightforward enough. What I really want to talk about here is the third one, which is the one libertarians are most eager to claim for themselves, which is, of course, liberté, right? Freedom. In that Case for Democratic Socialism essay in Marion West, I quote a speech that Abraham Lincoln gave in 1861 when he was defending the system of free labor in the North as morally superior to slavery, which is, of course, correct. And in the course of that, he was essentially touching on concerns that people had even then, that even in capitalist free labor, there are still potentially problematic relations of domination and exploitation. So Lincoln says at one point in that speech that there is no such thing as a free man being fixed for life in the condition of a hired laborer. That line makes him sound like a socialist, but he wasn't. His political vision was limited to replacing slave labor in the South with capitalist wage labor. Lincoln acknowledged that the capitalist system wouldn't be a system of deep and genuine freedom if workers had to spend their whole lives as workers, but he insisted that this would not happen. Instead, the prudent, penniless beginner in the world would work as a hired laborer for a while, then he could save up a surplus with which to buy tools or land for himself, work on his own account for another while, and eventually hire another beginner to help him. And as much as I revere Abraham Lincoln, if we're honest about this, the idea that everyone who's sufficiently hardworking and prudent can be upwardly mobile through the class hierarchy was already wishful thinking in 1861. Even then, there were only so many lifeboats out of the working class. In 2024, I hope that it's obvious to everyone that things don't work, they can't work the way that Lincoln hoped they would work for the majority of the population. Just the arithmetic doesn't work out. We'd all starve to death without people picking up crops, people processing food, people driving trucks from processing plants to grocery stores, people stocking shelves at grocery stores, and the rest. Those people can't all become upper middle class professionals in any even over the course of their lives. In any technologically advanced modern economy, most of this labor just is going to be done by groups of people working together. The world of small farmers and independent craftsmen isn't coming back. And while class mobility, certainly hasn't ceased to exist in the 163 years since President Lincoln's speech, again, it certainly does exist. It's just not structurally possible for most of us to be capitalists any more than the laws of gravity would allow the majority of cheerleaders forming themselves into a pyramid to be on the top level. Our choices are that most people will work communally but be ruled by capitalists who rule their little economic fiefdoms like little kings and queens, or that we're going to continue to work communally but extend democracy to the half of our waking lives that most adults spend at work through some sort of collective ownership and democratic control of the means of production. And by the way, it's only half because of the results of previous workers' struggles by those people that Walter Block calls parasites. So after that point in the essay, I spent quite a bit of time talking about what the logistics of an economically viable form of collective ownership might look like. But what I want to emphasize right now is that whether people work together but are subject to the whims of an unelected boss, or whether they collectively and democratically run the place and collectively and democratically decide how the products of their collective labor will be divvied up at the end of the process, is, to me, ultimately a question about freedom from domination. That's not the libertarian notion of freedom, which is non-interference, which I argue in the debate is totally vacuous, that it tells us nothing about what the distribution of wealth should be. That's a sort of basic argument that I get from people like G.A. Cohen and Matt Brunig. I won't repeat any of it here. But what I'm talking about is a much, I think, deeper and more important idea of freedom. It's what political theorists call the Republican theory of freedom. And of course, that's Republican with a small r, like Republican, not Republican like the odious political organization in the contemporary United States. And that, to me, is the biggest and most important disagreement that's revealed in debates like this, the disagreement about freedom. And part of the purpose of doing this kind of debate is to convince anyone who might be watching in the audience who's persuadable. I mean, it wouldn't be psychologically realistic for either Walter or I to hope to persuade one another. We're both too dug in way too deep on the sort of fundamental worldview questions. But the goal is always to persuade whatever chunk of the potential audience is persuadable, or at the very least to plant some seeds that might help them be persuaded down the line. And sometimes people say, look, why do you talk to this lunatic who says, well, I'm not going to tell you what he says because, no spoilers, but he says some pretty amazing things in this debate that we're going to watch tonight. So the idea is, anybody who takes this guy seriously is just unsalvageable. But I think that this fundamentally misses the point, even the part of the point that's about persuasion. Oftentimes, people who nod along with libertarian rhetoric about freedom might have second thoughts when they see where those libertarian principles actually lead. You might agree with the premise when it's a sort of floating abstraction, and it's like specific meaning isn't all that clear. But then when you get to the conclusions that are logically arrived at from that premise, you get off the bus and really reconsider. I see tremendous value in that. Like, look, to name somebody who, I don't always agree with about things that are happening, at the moment in the left or whatever, but who's been on this show before. I think Sam Cedar is a master of this. When he argues with libertarians, like when he did the debate with Yaron Brook from the Ayn Rand Institute, and they were talking at the end of it about the Miami condo collapse. And Sam said, you don't see a role for government and safety and preventing things like that? And Yaron said, no, it should be the responsibility of the tenants to do research on the company's safety practices. That's a real, Deuteronomy 30:19 moment. I've set before you on this day life and death. People who might nod along with the rhetoric about freedom might realize that this is a theory of what freedom is that's actually horrifying. So that's that half of the reason to do these debates. It's about persuasion. But the other half, and this is something Vivek Chibber and I spoke to, Vivek, I should say, not me, right? Like I just kind of nodded and said, yeah, good point. But Vivek spoke to it in a really eloquent way last week on the show when he was talking about the value of free speech. And how part of that value has actually nothing to do with persuading anyone. It's that it keeps us intellectually honest by making us run through our paces and us get clearer and sharper in our own heads about what we think and why by dissecting the arguments that are made against us, even some pretty absurd arguments. That to sort of see exactly what's wrong with that, you have to dig pretty deep, right? You can learn a lot that way about what you think, about values that might be lodged so deep you never actually take them out and expose them to the sunlight and think about them in that more critical and reflective way. And again, I see tremendous value in that. So in that spirit, let's talk about two really specific things that came up in this debate about that are both in some way or another about freedom, and then wrap up with a more general point. So the first has to do with so-called economic freedom rankings that are put out by the Libertarian Fraser Institute in Canada. I actually wrote an article about these rankings for Jacobin in 2021, but I guess Walter never read that, because in his reply to me and Marion West, it's called Rejoinder to Ben Burgis, the case for laissez-faire capitalism. Walter makes heavy use of the Fraser Institute numbers to try to show that the more capitalist and the less socialist a country is, the more of all the good things it has, and the less of all the bad things. But the rankings themselves are just brutally absurd. As I say in the debate you're about to watch, but I don't have time there to elaborate, the rankings don't measure a goddamn thing except how creative think tank hacks can be when they need to put a bunch of numbers into a blender over and over again until they get the results that they want. In fact, I would argue the results themselves prove without a shadow of a doubt that these rankings don't measure how socialist or even how social democratic a country is, since the countries in the capitalist world that have the most of the things that socialists and social democrats advocate as far as like short-term reforms go, and the least of the things that libertarians want, places like Sweden and Denmark and Norway, actually show up as very capitalist. And there are places like Haiti that have almost none of those things, that show up as very economically unfree, or the way that people like Walter would put it, and the way that I think even a lot of Fraser's own sort of promotion of these rankings would lead us to think about it, would make them more socialist. Haiti has such a crazy degree of hyper-exploitation that, as recently as Barack Obama's first term, when Hillary Clinton was Secretary of State, WikiLeaks cables came out that showed that Hillary Clinton's State Department was lobbying the Haitian government at the behest of various American companies with subcontractors in Haiti against raising the minimum wage in Haiti to the princely sum of $5 a day. So again, where do the laws provide more protections for organizing a union? Haiti or Sweden? Where is there a bigger welfare state? Haiti or Sweden? Come on. And in fact, if you do a little, actually, I think I mentioned this one in the debate, but when I sort of first realized how that there was something that must have gone completely wrong here, was reading this Peter Leeson paper where he makes heavy use of the Fraser rankings. And in that, right, he says, okay, he actually mentions, and this completely undermines Leeson's case, but he mentions it anyway without seeming to realize it, that he says, okay, only a few countries have become, he wrote this paper in 2005, less capitalist in the last 25 years. And sure, lots of bad things have happened in those places. And the three countries that he mentions, one of them is Ukraine, right? So if you take the Fraser rankings seriously, between 1980 and 2005, Ukraine became less capitalist, right? So taken literally, that would mean the Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic, a member state of the USSR, was more capitalist than post-privatization, post-shock therapy Ukraine in 2005. I mean, this is just unspeakably silly. And if you start looking behind the curtain at the methodology, which you can find a lot of on Fraser's website, you start to get a sense of how. They're including just wacky shit like sound money. And if you really look at what they mean by that, it's like if there's a lot of inflation, then they count that as less economically free or less capitalist, and they have a justification that, inflation happening, sort of takes away the benefits of economic freedom. So we're going to count places as less free if they have lots of inflation, which again is just totally absurd. It puts the cart before the horse. an argument you would expect a libertarian or a conservative to make is, oh, look, all these horrible socialist policies meddling with the market will lead to lots of inflation. That would be a real anti-socialist argument, but they're not making that, right? They're saying, oh, we're just going to count the bad things happening as evidence of less capitalism, and then we're going to conclude, oh, see, less capitalism means more bad things happen. It's a completely unserious way to argue. And in the Jacobin article, I said, like, a lot of the things that they count, like, as their general categories for analysis, don't even sound like they have anything to do with economic freedom in any sense that might be in dispute between libertarians and neoliberals on the one hand and social democrats and socialists on the other hand. And even one of the ones that does sort of sound like it would be relevant, that's is it legal regime and property right, or sorry, rule of law and property rights, I think it is. I kind of took the time in the article to break down the criteria. This is the A through H graphic, and if you look at those the criteria there, right? So the things that they count for rule of law and property rights, and that already sounds very suspicious. Oh, wait a second, not just property rights, but rule of law and property rights, right? And so it's A, judicial independence, B, impartial courts, C, protection of property rights, D, military interference in rule of law and politics, E, integrity of the legal system, F, legal enforcement of the contracts, G, regulatory costs of the sale of real property, H, reliability of police. And of course, you don't get a lot of, people with like social democratic politics going out saying, you know what the problem is with America? Police are too reliable and the legal system has too much integrity, and there's too little military interference in rule of law and politics, right? So I guess when Augusto Pinochet overthrew Salvador Allende in Chile in 1973, then Chile lost economic freedom points, right? So it was counted as less capitalist because of military interference in rule of law and politics, right? Item D. The only thing, right, out of these 8 criteria that even sounds relevant is C, protection of property rights. And I think that's almost certainly completely irrelevant. Right? Because if property rights are being protected against nationalization, then I understand how they're relevant. But in any other sense, they're not relevant, right? And I'd seriously doubt that almost any of these numbers have anything to do with nationalization. Right? You see similar things, when you look at other criteria. So at the time, Tibor Rutar, who's also been a guest on the show, and I'm actually, very fond of him in many ways as an interlocutor, but I find him very unconvincing on this point. So he did a critique of the Jacobin article on Chris Freeman's Substack that we might or might not have the graphic of, but in any case, it's a Tibor response. So it's called Economic Freedom Indexes do seem to measure how capitalist a country is, response to Ben Burgis. And I would say, I don't know if Tibor, this was a guest post on somebody else's blog. I don't know if he wrote that title, but if he did, it's a very misleading title, right? Because I think even what he shows in there doesn't bear this out. He does a lot of, if you recombine the numbers to take out certain categories and subcategories, you still get broadly similar results. Although even at that, when he's done messing with it, some of the results don't look that similar. But I think the bigger point, he's just kind of assuming that, okay, some of the Fraser categories are surely fine, right? So if we just take out the specific ones I criticize, then the criticism is irrelevant, which I think misses the point of the criticism. What the criticism shows is that these are really dishonest hacks, right? They're just putting a bunch of different unrelated factors in a blender to get the results that they want. That, economic freedom leads to all the good things, and leads away from all the bad things. And so they're more than happy to just stuff the bad things resulting into the blender with everything else, right? So if you look at the way that things are mixed together there. I mean, even if you look at the details of some of what he talks about in the article about regulation, right? There's all sorts of things that are factored into the like, oh, how much regulation is there, size of government part of the Fraser rankings that have absolutely nothing to do with issues in dispute between social democrats and socialists in one camp, right? People who, in other words, either want sort of socialistic kind of reforms to capitalism or want to maybe start there but go further. And on the other hand, neoliberals and libertarians. So a lot of that, in fact, Matt Brunig has done great stuff about this. A lot of that has to do with stuff like how hard it is to start a business, which, if you really look into the details, it's like a lot of that's like how many forms you need to fill out, stuff like that. And so people say, aha, Norway and Sweden, actually have like pretty low regulatory oversights, less in some ways than the United States. It's like, yeah, but a lot of that's because of American federalism, that there are various like state and federal things that you have to go through. Whereas some of these other countries they're being compared to, they're more centralized, which is in fact not something libertarians and conservatives have typically been fans of. That they, those guys typically like federalism, decentralization, which leads you to more forms to fill out with more places. And again, it has absolutely nothing to do with stuff like how wages are set, which in the Nordics has often been by sectoral bargaining, which is so you have like big powerful unions that bargain for wages on behalf of entire sectors of the economy, right, including non-members of the unions, and is every bit as intrusive in capitalist property rights in its own way as the minimum wage stuff. So I think the idea, again, if you wanted to show, like, I think if the Fraser people were serious people, they would say they could argue for like specific policies leading to more of the good things and less of the bad things, and just show you like clean numbers for that. But all the numbers, even within the broad categories, they're mixing and matching all sorts of subcategories in a way that just make the whole thing meaningless mush, right? I don't see any reason to take any category or subcategory these people give us seriously. The other thing about freedom that I wanted to touch on, because it comes up in the debate, was about something I referred to a minute ago. That was Milton Friedman and Friedrich Hayek, who were two of the biggest leading lights of libertarianism in the late 20th century, who both supported, were apologists to one extent or another for the military right-wing dictator Augusto Pinochet after he overthrew the democratically elected Chilean socialist president Salvador Allende and initiated this reign of terror against the Chilean left because he couldn't defeat them electorally. And in the debate, I say this, and then Walter says, well, people say that about Milton Friedman. He totally ignores the Hayek part. People say that about Milton Friedman, but all he did was go down to Chile and give Pinochet economic advice, and he went to China and gave Deng Xiaoping the same economic advice. So why is it that people are using the Chile one to prove something and not the Deng Xiaoping one? It's like, okay, well, first of all, I actually think criticizing libertarians for being too buddy-buddy with the authoritarian leader of China is also definitely legitimate, right? But also I think some relevant differences between the two situations are that Deng Xiaoping hadn't just overthrown a democratically elected government and initiated a bloody reign of terror against supporters of that government, right? China had already been authoritarian long before he came on the scene. And particularly if you look at the letter that Milton Friedman wrote to Pinochet after his visit, warmly thanking him for his hospitality and saying he was happy to see that Chile was on the right track. I think that does go beyond just, he'll just give economic advice to anybody. If Darth Vader asked him for economic advice, he'd give it. Say, thank you so much. You're such a great host. I'm so glad to see the country's on the right track. That sounds to me like actual Pinochet apologism. And that's just Friedman. The case is actually way, way better for Hayek. So if the best thing to look at here, back in 2013, Corey Robin wrote something on his blog called the Hayek-Pinochet Connection. And in there, he goes into the details, and he says, no, this is actually not at all true, right? That all Hayek did was say Pinochet was better than Allende, and how bad is that? It's like, well, first of all, that would actually be very, very bad if Hayek was saying that the bloody military dictatorship who overthrew democracy in Chile and initiated a reign of terror against the Chilean left was better than the democratically elected president who came before him, right? So even if that were true, that'd be bad enough, but it's not true, right? So from the Robin article, Hayek first visited Pinochet's Chile in 1977 when he was 78. Amnesty International had already provided him with ample evidence of Pinochet's crimes, much to his annoyance, but he went anyway. He met with Pinochet and other government officials who he described as educated, reasonable, and insightful men. According to the Chilean newspaper El Mercurio, Hayek told reporters that he talked to Pinochet about the issue of limited democracy and representative government. He said that in his writings, he showed that unlimited democracy does not work because it creates the forces that in the end destroy democracy. He said that the head of state listened carefully, and he'd asked him to provide him with the documents written on this issue. Hayek complied with the dictator's request. He had his secretary send a draft of what eventually became Chapter 17, a model constitution in the third volume of Hayek's Law, Legislation, and Liberty. The chapter includes a section on emergency powers, which defends dictatorships when the long-run preservation of a free society is threatened. Corey Robin notes, long run is an elastic phrase, and by free society, Hayek didn't mean liberal democracy. He has something more particular and peculiar in mind. Quote, that the coercive powers of government are restricted to the enforcement of universal rules of just conduct and cannot be used for the achievement of particular purposes. That phrase, Robin notes, is doing a lot of the work here. Hayek believed, for example, that the effort to secure a specific distribution of wealth constituted the pursuit of a particular purpose. So the threats to a free society might not simply come from international civil war, nor must they be imminent. In other words, it's fine to have, this is me, not Corey Robin. It's fine to have a temporary dictatorship in order to prevent socialists from violating capitalist property rights, because what they really mean when they talk about freedom is capitalist property rights, right? So, but what is that, right? What we talk about capitalist property rights, right? Property rights in the means of production is the freedom of particular sort of miniature economic dictators to run their little miniature kingdoms as they please, right? I mean, this is the freedom of a child who has trapped a bug in a jar to do whatever he wants to with the bug, except for in this analogy, the bug is the working class majority of society. It's an absurd account of freedom. And the reason I'm really emphasizing this point, and this is the last thing I want to say here, is that this notion of what freedom is, right, fundamentally does not track what ordinary people care about when they think about freedom. Right? And I think this goes from everything from the sort of long-term goals about workers' control of the means of production that would, sort of end this domination of the majority of society by a wealthy minority, to very short-term issues like, are you going to stay in a job you hate, right, for fear of losing your health insurance? Or can you take a year off to write that novel, right? These are the kinds of issues that impact how free people are. And I think there's a bad habit by some on the left to sort of cede the freedom framing to the libertarians, if anything, right, to say, oh, those guys care too much about freedom as opposed to these other values, that's where they go wrong, that they have a sort of selfish obsession with their own rights as opposed to the greater good. And I think that's exactly the wrong way to argue with them, right? So I just saw this quote from Naomi Klein, who's somebody who does good work, but I think people know I have some disagreements with her. But somebody quoted this in that panel I was on, that Jason and I were on at UC Irvine the other day, where Klein is talking about economic shock therapy, and she says that the neoliberals who are carried it out, she accuses them of being utopians who are obsessed with this long-term vision of economic freedom, and said, oh, we don't need grandiose visions of freedom or something like that, right? I think this is exactly the wrong way to argue against neoliberalism. We need to argue against this stuff on the basis of a much more expansive view of human freedom, as opposed to the privatized petty tyrannies that are being defended by libertarians. You have been watching free public content from Give Them an Argument. To access every single episode of the show, the main show on Monday nights, all of the streams, all of the debate breakdowns, all of the patron-exclusive postgames on Monday nights, all of the patron-exclusive bonus episodes every week, and much, much more, go to patreon.com/Ben Burgis. I cannot resist ending this with, don't be foolish.